Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and this video is going to be maybe a little more off the wall than typical because I don't even know why this movie came to my mind, but Rock-a-Doodle entered my brain for some reason, and it was all about basically the opening scene, and it triggered an interesting thought, which we'll get to in a minute. Before we get to the actual topic of the video, though, I do have a question for those of you watching. How many of you would be interested in having me do a video of a playthrough of a game like Journeys in Middle Earth or War of the Ring or something like that? Now that video is not going to be like an entire session because both of those games are really long, but there's other games that you might pick. But if there's a Lord of the Rings game that I own that y'all would be interested in seeing a playthrough of, or at least a partial playthrough of, I might be willing to do that if there's enough of you interested in it. So just putting that out there as a thought. For this video, the thought that occurred to me was about the power and ambiguity of myth. And the reason this came to mind, and the funny thing is, I don't even remember if for sure if I watched Rock-a-Doodle all the way through as a kid. Like if I did, it was so long ago that I don't remember. But I do remember part of the opening scene at least, which makes me think I probably watched it because it's not like they had YouTube back then where you could just see scenes from things and, do stuff like that. So I don't remember exactly, but the fun thing about it is the opening scene sets up, and if you haven't seen this movie, I'm going to spoil it to some extent, but, that's kind of the nature of the beast. The whole thing about Rock-a-Doodle is that it starts with this background of the main character Chanticleer, who's a rooster, crows every morning to raise the sun. Like his crowing is what makes the sun rise, and it keeps the rain away, and it basically keeps things sunny on the farm. Well, there's a Duke of Owls who has some other bad bird come and try to fight Chanticleer to hopefully, get rid of him so he won't be able to do that. And Chanticleer manages to win the fight, but because he's so busy fighting the guy, the sun comes up on its own without him. And then everybody on the farm who used to be so appreciative of his raising the sun every day now thinks he's a fraud, and as a result, he leaves. Well, the Duke of Owls begins to basically somehow create bad weather, meaning lots and lots of rain and no sun, and basically this farm never gets sun anymore, and this is as a result of the fact that Chanticleer is now gone. The whole rest of the story is basically about this boy who's been read part of this story by his mom and who is also experiencing a torrential flood-producing rain at their own farm, coincidentally. Gets turned into a cat by the Duke of Owls and then goes and with some of the farm animals from Chanticleer's farm to try to find Chanticleer, who is now basically an Elvis impersonator in the big city, and they have to get him back so that he can crow and bring back the sun, which of course is exactly what ends up happening. There's a lot more subplots and stuff in the middle that I'm not getting into detail in here, but this is kind of the key point. Chanticleer eventually does come back to the main farm. He crows, the sun comes out, the rain stops. And the reason that this came to mind is because, like I said, it really kind of hits on the power and ambiguity of myth. Now, there are other connections you could draw between this and Lord of the Rings. Most prominently, the fact that the person who voices Chanticleer is Glenn Campbell, and he has the same first name as Glenn Yarbrough, who is the minstrel in the Rankin Bass Return of the King. So you could make really interesting connections there, I guess, if you really wanted to. Glenn Campbell, of course, is himself a singer and musician. So kind of an interesting thing going on there, but that's really beside the point. What I find really interesting here is the ambiguity that the movie leaves us. And by the way, this movie is hardly, great cinema even as a kid's movie. So I'm not necessarily recommending you go out and watch it. I gave you kind of enough of the basics that if you've never seen this movie before, you really don't need to go watch it for purposes of of understanding what I'm going to talk about here. If you just really want to, though, feel free. I think it's free on Tubi right now. At any rate, Chanticleer, does he actually raise the sun? Does he actually keep the rain away? Or does he not? It's kind of ambiguous because in the movie the sun rises without him, but he actually does manage to keep the rain away with his crow. Like he actually when he crows, that's when the rain stops and the sun comes out again, and it begs the question, what exactly is the real effect of his crow and what's going on here? So this whole thing plays into the idea of myth because myth, when you really think about it in its proper sense, is basically the stories mankind in their own, different social groups tells themselves in order to explain their past, the world around them, all this kind of stuff. If we look at it from the point of view of Tolkien, who, in debating with Lewis about religion, called Christianity a true myth, in trying to help Lewis understand it. Lewis was kind of stuck on this idea that Christianity is just a myth. And Tolkien was like, well, it's a true myth. In other words, yes, it's technically a myth in that sense. It just happens to be the true one. This was kind of Tolkien's take on the whole thing. And by that, Tolkien did not mean it's a story that is basically fictional but which tells us some truth about the world. He meant it is a story which provides the kind of explanation about the world in our past which myths try to do in general, and this one happens to be the factually accurate one. So this is what Tolkien is talking about when he says myth, at least a lot of the time when he uses that word. And there's a sense in which The Lord of the Rings is a myth, and in a looser sense. And there's also the sense in which we can look at the Silmarillion as containing myths in two different ways. One of those ways is the whole idea that the Silmarillion is in fact the true story of how Middle-earth became formed, shaped, and, its history. And then there is the later idea that Tolkien kind of came up with, which is the Silmarillion versions of the stories of the two trees and how the sun and moon came about. All of that is kind of mannish, corruptions of the truth that they got from, that they may or may not have gotten from the elves, but which the elves know better because they were actually instructed directly by the Valar, who knew better. So there's two senses in which the Silmarillion can be considered a mythology background in the Lord of the Rings, and there's a sense in which the Lord of the Rings itself is a kind of allegorical, I don't use that word lightly, mythology for our own, our own time. By that I mean, and let me explain that because, like I said, allegory is kind of a touchy word when it comes to Tolkien. I mean in the sense that the Lord of the Rings contains a lot of things in it that Tolkien considered true in a broad sense. And here I'm specifically thinking mainly of the fact that Providence plays a role in the affairs of humankind. So this is not in the sense of allegory being a direct one-to-one correspondence, but more the idea that the mythology in the Lord of the Rings is, as Tolkien would say, very much fundamentally religious and Catholic, and a lot of his own theology about how Providence works makes its way into the story. And we could see this in a number of examples. So let's take a look at The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion through this lens of myth and see how that mythology type thinking really gives us the power and the ambiguity that Rock-a-Doodle does, because it's kind of an interesting play between, the whole idea of truth and fiction and all those different things. So, of course, in The Lord of the Rings proper, we have, like I said, a lot of things about Providence that go on. It's a little more explicit in The Hobbit because you get Gandalf basically telling Bilbo at the end that you didn't do this by yourself. You're just a small fellow in a large world. And so you get this idea that all his luck was not really luck, but somebody else had a hand in that. And in The Lord of the Rings, this becomes a lot more subdued, and you have to really kind of look and infer yourself how much of this is providential. One of the really big examples that I like that the Tolkien professor kind of brought to my attention is when the wind blows, the great, huge volcanic clouds that are now covering the Pelennor fields and basically all of Gondor. And the wind blows it, there's a wind coming up from the sea that both brings Aragorn's boats that he's taken from the Corsairs. It helps him get upriver, but it also clears the sky so that now there's sunlight over Mordor's army, and it arrives just in time for Theoden and the Rohirrim to blow their horns, and all this other stuff that all happens kind of together. And this is one where you do have to kind of infer it, because there's nothing in the story itself that makes it clear that this is explicitly the action of, say, Manwe Sulimo, the Lord of Winds, who is stepping in to make something happen. Nevertheless, the timing of it all is so absurdly lucky that you can't help but think that there has to be something more behind it than just luck. And this is a theme I've explored before. I did a video on comparing the movie Passengers with Chris Pratt and Jennifer Lawrence with how Tolkien handles Providence. And my key point in that video was, in Passengers, you have a lot of the same kind of thing going on. Lots of just extremely lucky things that happen. The timing of when things happen, how they happen, all this stuff. It's almost like it was planned to work out in favor of the main characters by the end. But in that world, you never get the sense that there is any kind of higher power behind it. It's just luck. And it always left kind of a bad aftertaste in my mouth, if you know what I mean. Whereas Tolkien, he does the same thing, but he does it in a world which accepts the fact that there is a higher power, even though there's very little reference to anything like that. You get like maybe one or two references to the Valar as things in the story, plus one reference to Orome, and I mean, you almost get nothing, but there's enough there, and of course Gandalf's words in The Hobbit, plus some of the discussion in the Council of Elrond, they talk about the fact that there is a mind. They don't use that word exactly, but there is intent behind some of the things that have happened. Elrond at the very beginning of the Council of Elrond says, I say you've all been called, but you haven't really been, but, given the fact that we're all here just in the nick of time, make no mistake, we have been chosen to do this. Well, if there's somebody choosing and calling people, and Boromir's dream, and Faramir's dream too, all these things make it pretty clear that there is something else at work. And of course, Gandalf makes the same point to Frodo. There's some mind at work, some power besides Sauron was at work for Bilbo to find the ring. So there's all this stuff in The Lord of the Rings that lets you know that there is in fact a higher power, but it doesn't beat you over the head with it every single time something happens. So when that wind comes at the Pelennor Fields, and the sun rises on Theoden's shield, and the wind brings Aragorn's ships up to the harbor, all these things happen, and we have to do the work, basically on our end, to go, that looks suspiciously like the same mind that might have been calling Boromir and Legolas and all these people to the Council of Elrond. And you'll see that, over and over. Gollum falling into the cracks of doom because of his own greed. There's all these different elements that we can point to and go, it's not explicit, but there's something there. But it also is possible to, consider these things as just coincidences that have nothing to do with any higher power or other intelligence. So there's that ambiguity element of, the mythology. The Lord of the Rings gives us just enough references to know that there is a mythology behind the story of some kind of providential something that may be guiding events, or at least helping events along. And then the rest of the story gives us ambiguous moments where it's like, well, was that Providence acting there? Or was that just, we just got lucky, you know? So there's kind of that ambiguity. And it's precisely the ambiguity that gives a measure of power to the story, too. Because you could interpret it either way, anybody who wants to interpret it one way or the other can be perfectly legitimate in their own explanation of events. If somebody just refuses to say that Manwe Sulimo or Eru himself is causing the wind to blow Aragorn's ships up and clearing the cloud rack, you know, and they just want to say that's just luck, you can have that explanation. It works. I mean, there's no reason that couldn't happen, and the good guys just get that lucky. But the fact that the ambiguity exists is what allows different readers from different backgrounds to come to the same story and get, so much satisfaction out of it, because whichever one you find more pleasing aesthetically to your own sense of what makes for a good story, you can have. I mean, there are some things where they're almost explicit, like I said, where Elrond talks in the Council of Elrond, where Gandalf's talking to Frodo. There's some things there where it's hard to escape it. But there's enough instances of ambiguity that you can have your cake and eat it too, sort of. The other sense in which this is a very powerful thing, the whole mythology, is that the myth provides not only explanations of individual events, but it provides, this kind of, large vistas behind, that Tolkien talks about as being one of the key draws of the story. The whole idea of the Lord of the Rings and what makes it so compelling is that there's these constant references to things that are just beyond the edge of sight that we hear about and we find out little tidbits about, like the story of Beren and Luthien. We get the reference to Turin and Orome and all these different things, but it's not ever enough to really give us the full story. But the fact that there's just enough myth there in the background to tell us there is like a metaphysical story that these people tell themselves in some way that explains their past, or at least they're thinking in those terms. We don't know what all that is, because we don't get that until we get the Silmarillion, but the whole idea that there is this kind of mythology, like we have, you could say, if all you had was the Lord of the Rings, that Gandalf talking about a power beyond Sauron and Elrond saying that you were called here, all this stuff, that's their belief system, but that doesn't make it true, right? Now, of course, when you read the Silmarillion, it's a little bit harder to, do that, or although, again, once you take the idea that the Silmarillion could just be mannish myths that are kind of corruptions of what the elves taught, you can still kind of do that. But I think virtually everybody accepts that the Silmarillion is at some level, for purposes of inner world storytelling, basically true. Eru is basically the god figure of Middle Earth, and he did exist and he did create the world with the assistance of the Ainur. Like, no, I don't think anybody's really going to go so far as to say that all of that is just myth making in the story. So you get, this brings us to the Silmarillion. Like I said, the Silmarillion has two layers kind of how you can look at it. One of them being the Silmarillion as this is how it happened, and the Silmarillion as this is the kind of mannish story of how it happened, which isn't really true. In both senses, the story is still a myth, but one is true myth in story, and the other is not true myth in story. So from like Tolkien's perspective, you would look at this as Christianity is the true myth. It's the way that things really happened and how things are really going on in the world, whereas something like Zoroastrianism or, something else, some other religion, Buddhism, those are not true myths because they try to explain the past and metaphysics and all this other stuff that we try to explain with myth. So they're both myths in that sense. They're doing that kind of explanatory job, but one is accurate and the other one is something that man made up. So you have both of these kind of things going on with the Silmarillion, potentially, because on the one hand, the original Silmarillion writings were meant to be, this is kind of like what actually happened, and then on the other hand, it's like, well, this is just a mannish corruption of what they were told by the elves, and so it's not accurate. And this, again, is a nice ambiguity in one sense, because as I've talked about before, with the way that you get this shift in time of how Tolkien thinks about his own mythology, it gets really interesting because Tolkien at one point was considering, and may have held on to this idea for his entire life. It's not really clear where exactly he landed, but certainly for a long period he was looking at basically saying that the Silmarillion as we have it today was just kind of mostly made up or corrupted from the true story. The sun and the moon were there the whole time, the world was always round, all this stuff. And because Tolkien himself changed his mind about these things, we ourselves are left with the ambiguity of, which is the true story in a sense. Because Christopher Tolkien gives us one version of the story and presents it kind of as true myth within the bounds of the Middle-earth secondary world. But on the other hand, we have Tolkien's own writings where he seems to go, well, maybe not. Let's, this it should actually be this other way that, that makes the Silmarillion myth something that's not really true in the secondary world. So we have not only ambiguity within the story itself, which there are some ambiguities even in the Silmarillion as published, because again, you can look at things and go, was that Providence or was that not? But it's also ambiguous even to us in the primary world to some extent, whether we should consider this like in-world secondary true myth or not. But the other thing I talked about in that recent video about how he was considering changing the mythology is how powerful the mythology is. One of the things that we would kind of lose in that in changing the Silmarillion from this is within the secondary world the true myth to in the secondary world even this is false myth, is we would lose so much of kind of the beauty of the myth as it was told originally. There is something powerful about the story as told, even if not true, about the trees, their destruction, then getting the sun and moon out of them, all these other things. There's something appealing to at least a lot of human minds in that mythology. Not necessarily because it's true, but because it just does something for us that is really hard to articulate and explain. And this is the fascinating thing about Rock-a-Doodle, because Rock-a-Doodle kind of does the same thing. It's like, is this true or is this not? Because if he's actually causing the rain to leave with his crow, then there really is some power there that we haven't really explained, but he's not causing the sun to rise either. Now you can explain this by saying he never really had the power to make the sun rise. He only had the power to make the rain go away, and they just confuse the two. And this is remarkably similar to that whole problem of, is the Silmarillion true or false myth within the secondary world? We get this idea of, well, some of this is true in a sense, but not all of it is actually true in a sense, because some of that's been corrupted. So like has Chanticleer been, kind of given a story by his forebears that they thought was true because something in their past just kind of corrupted the truth that they actually had and handed down. I mean, when you think about that, it's like, this is a kid's movie which is not particularly deep, and yet somehow it hits on sort of the same kind of theme. But the other thing about it is, like I said, going back to the power of myth, there's an element of, even if it wasn't true at all, Chanticleer coming back is still a big deal because he puts up the fight and does what has to be done to fight the owls. And there's this whole thing of, sometimes whether you believe a myth is factually true or not is really kind of beside the point. What matters more is, do you get some kind of sense of truth that isn't necessarily factual out of the myth that needs to be believed. And this kind of ties back to some things that Tolkien and Lewis and maybe even Chesterton, I think all three of them kind of touched on this. The idea that, and the one I remember best is Lewis's idea. It was something to the effect, and I'm going to screw up the quote because I don't remember it exactly, but it was something to the effect that, children already know that dragons exist. What we need to teach them is that there are knights who can slay the dragon. And so there's this idea that mythology is, even to the extent that we use it, and a lot of the time the form in which we deliver mythology is things like fairy tales and, stuff like that teach moral lessons without even pretending to be true. But this idea that you get the mythology in order to create the kind of person that you want to be in your society. This is the real power of myth. The stories we tell ourselves, because humans are narrative beings, we just do stories. It's what we do. The fact that we rely so heavily on stories and are constantly telling stories to ourselves about ourselves is why myths are so important. The myths that we tell ourselves, even if we don't necessarily believe they're factually accurate, are going to inform so much of our value system, our our outlook on the world, our worldview, all these different things. And so, funny enough, it's when Chanticleer stops believing in himself that he kind of loses his power to do anything. And it's only when, this is the one part I didn't mention before, it's only when the rest of the farm animals start showing that they do believe in him again that he kind of regains that power. And as a result, this is the power of myth. The things that we believe, even if we're not talking about belief in terms of factual things, still play a huge role in what we believe we can do, what we believe we can impact in the world, all of this stuff. So at the end of the day, this is why I thought this was an interesting topic, because Rock-a-Doodle, for all of its not very impressive storytelling or any of this other stuff, it still touches on this very key idea that is true across human culture and everything else, that mythology gives us this ambiguity but also clarity, and from that ambiguity and clarity comes a real power to shape human culture and even individual lives. It's really fascinating to think about that. And the fact that you can get that lesson by watching a movie that wasn't that great, even by kids' movie standards, is really interesting, I think. So, just wanted to share some of those thoughts with you guys. Hope that you enjoyed that video. If you did, please give it a like, share it around. Make sure you subscribe if you want to catch my future content. Click the bell icon if you're on YouTube to make sure you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter to catch Tolkien-related trivia questions every week, and check the description below for other support and social links. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour and Robert Kindling.